Hi there, and welcome to this latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and handy tips to develop your understanding and practice of argumentation. In this lesson, we're going to look at issue analysis for propositions of policy. If we're going to advocate courses of action that change the way things are right now, what are going to be the responsibilities for that advocate in a policy debate? In order to do that, we need to review some basic concepts regarding the anatomy of any dispute. The concepts of prima facie case, stock issues, and policy claims. For more specific information about the anatomy of a dispute, which gets at the primary responsibilities that any arguers in a dispute over a proposition need to fulfill, I'd refer you to a previous online lesson in this series. Once we engage in that brief review, we'll then look at the four primary stock issues for policy cases and examine specific areas of argument that advocates for change need to focus on in order to develop those policy stock issues. Finally, I'll briefly introduce the idea of an issues brief, a tool that helps you compile the results of your issue analysis that's absolutely important for both advocates and opponents of a policy change in a debate. But first, let's do a bit of review. A prima facie case, according to Inch and Tudor, is an extended argument that on its face presents good and sufficient arguments for adopting the viewpoint or action proposed by an advocate. As we examined in a previous online lesson in this series, any dispute is going to involve at least two assumptions. First is that the defenders of the status quo, the way things are right now, enjoy presumption. In other words, the audience or judge of a particular dispute is going to assume that the side that enjoys presumption, the way things are right now, maintaining the present system without change, is going to be the default position that we agree with until we're presented with good reasons to change. And so any change advocate has a burden of proof to provide those good and sufficient reasons for changing the way things are right now, or changing our current presumptions. So in order to do that, a change advocate has to present a prima facie case. For that case to function in a way that meets the burden of proof, it has to satisfactorily address all of the major issues that a reasonable audience would expect to see addressed. In argumentation and debate theory, we refer to these major issues as stock issues, the issues that recipients expect to see addressed in order for the arguer to meet the burden of proof. What's important to realize about these stock issues is that they depend on the type of proposition. If we're arguing a proposition of fact, or a proposition of value, or a proposition of policy, each of those major types of claim that we might have a debate or dispute about are going to involve different sets of stock issues because the audience is being asked to make a different kind of decision. So what we're concerned with in this lesson are the stock issues for a policy proposition. So before we can get to that, we need to remember what a policy claim actually is. A policy claim is a call for a specific course of action, and it focuses on whether a change in policy or behavior should take place. Now, when we think about policy, the default position that many of us turn to is something having to do with government or politics. Policy involves things such as laws or regulations or other kinds of programs that are constructed by federal, state, or local governments, or perhaps a transnational organization like the United Nations. However, when we're talking about policy, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about government or politics. There are lots of different fields of argument where we engage in policy discussion. For instance, at any workplace, there's going to be discussions over courses of action. Should we engage in a particular strategic plan to build the corporation? Should we offer an initial public offering of our stock now or wait until later? Should we elect a new chairman of the board of trustees? Or whatever it happens to be. All sorts of organizations engage in discussions of courses of action. Indeed, you may very well be a member of a campus organization that involves arguments over policy all the time. Are we going to hold a specific fundraiser or not? Who are we going to select for our new members and who are we not going to select for our new members? Anytime we're debating or discussing courses of action, we would refer to this as a policy dispute. And so policy arguments are going to involve some specific stock issues, areas that must be covered in order to establish a prima facie case to advocate that course of action. And those stock issues are four: ill, blame, cure, and benefits versus costs. An advocate for a policy change must present good and sufficient reasons on all four of these stock issue areas. Otherwise, you can't have a prima facie case and you can't prevail and have the audience opt to engage in your course of action. So, how do we engage these issues? Ill is defined as a current wrong or harm that needs to be resolved. In other words, so what? What's the problem? If our basic position of presumption in a policy argument is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, the issue of ill is going to establish it's broke. There's some kind of problem that needs to be fixed, or there's some kind of condition that isn't optimally being met that we really want to have optimally met. That's the ill. Something needs to be fixed. The second issue is blame. We don't just want to know what the problem is. We need to engage the attribution of an ill to causes within the present policy system. In other words, where does this problem come from? If it's broke, what broke it? Because if we can't establish the cause to the problem, then establishing that our course of action is going to be able to deal with that problem effectively is going to be that much harder. We don't want to have a policy, for instance, that just deals with the symptoms of a problematic situation without getting at the underlying cause, because then how are we ultimately going to solve the problem? Speaking of solving the problem, that's the third stock issue, cure. The ability of a policy action to overcome the ill and the blame. In other words, to be more simple about it, the plan of action solves the problem. If you can't advocate that your policy is going to address that ill, then why are you doing that change of action in the first place? Finally, it's not enough just to prove that your plan can solve the problem. You need to establish an argument on benefits versus costs. In other words, establishing that the positive consequences of implementing the policy change are going to outweigh problems or disadvantages associated with taking a policy action. For a very rough analogy, you wouldn't want to perform an invasive surgery on a patient in order to cure some minor problem if the invasive surgery would actually cause more problems than it solves. If you're going to cut out a benign tumor, but there's a 75-25 chance that the surgery would kill the patient, why in the world would you do the surgery? Just stick with the tumor, right? That's what benefits versus costs get at. Because any policy change is going to entail some risks, you have to establish that the advantages of implementing the policy are going to outweigh any possible risks or disadvantages. Okay, so how can we understand the specific kinds of arguments that an advocate for change needs to make in order to establish a prima facie case on these stock issues? In order to do that, let's take a look at a sample policy controversy, the problem of student debt. And for the purposes of this video, it's important to point out that it is being produced at the present time in late February of 2016. So by the time you're watching this video, it's possible that certain circumstances may have changed. However, I'm guessing probably not significantly, at least in the short term. But we'll see. Anyway, let's assume that we want to engage in some kind of course of action that's going to change what we perceive as a problem with a student debt crisis in the United States. So, let's advance the following policy proposition. The United States should provide free undergraduate education at public colleges and universities. Now, before we go any further, let's just make this clear that this is a lesson in argumentation and policy advocacy. Neither I nor the university that I work for are officially endorsing this plan or any of the arguments within it. Okay, so if this is our proposition, the first thing that we need to do is establish the ill. And there's two ways that we can do that. The first is what we refer to as quantitative significance. Quantitative significance establishes the scope of the effects that are claimed, how many people will be affected and how frequently, for instance. In other words, what we're talking about is the magnitude of the problem. The policy advocate needs to establish the size of the problem. Is this a big enough problem that warrants us taking some sort of risk in changing the status quo? And so we're generally going to do this with some kind of factual data. For example, let's look at how we might argue quantitative significance for the proposition currently under discussion, that the United States federal government should offer free college education. We might look, for instance, at data that looks at how the class of 2015 is the most indebted ever. And we could examine the trend from 1992 to the present, just how much student debt has increased over that period, not just in terms of raw dollars, but in terms of inflation adjusted dollars. And if we were to move on with additional statistics to point out that there's about 4 million graduates at all levels between associate's degrees and PhDs, with the majority of them being associate's and bachelor's degrees recipients, we're talking about millions of students that are graduating from their degrees tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Now, this evidence and reasoning would establish quantitative significance for a problem. But that might not be all we need to establish. Besides just talking about facts and figures, we want to establish qualitative significance. Qualitative significance talks about the intensity of the effects that are claimed by the advocate, the extent that it strengthens or diminishes life or some other significant value. So when we're dealing with the quality of a problem, we're dealing with the effects of the problem on our core values. This is another key way of answering the so what question. Why is it that student loan debt is a big deal? It's just money, right? Well, qualitative significance arguments are going to help us get at that so what question. So students are graduating with tens of thousands of dollars in student debt. What's the big deal? Well, we could argue a number of different areas of qualitative significance. First of all, under economic conditions where there may be sizable numbers of college graduates that are unemployed after graduation, you can imagine the significant hits to the quality of life of these college graduates. It's tough enough to try to maintain a subsistence lifestyle, food, clothing, a roof over your head, etc., if you don't have a job, but imagine just how much worse those problems would be if you're also faced with tens of thousands of dollars of debt. So it's not just not having a job, but there's significant impacts on not just the graduate, but their families. We have an entire generation of college graduates that are moving back home to live with their parents, for instance. And so this causes problems not just for the individual graduate, but financial and emotional costs for the families as well. In addition, we have the lost potential contributions that college graduates can make to society. Lots of folks might decide that they don't want to major in order to develop a career in places like teaching or social work or volunteering for nonprofit organizations. Because if I'm facing tens of thousands of dollars of student debt, I might want to restrict the choice of my major to something that I perceive is going to enable me to make a lot of money. That's going to mean even if I do have a good job after graduation, it might not be the job that I want, and it might not be a job that really contributes to society, because I'm not as concerned about that as I am in getting these loans paid off. And so finally, we could also take a look at this problem as one of social justice. We might imagine, for instance, that we could look at the relationship between big student loan commitments and the reality that when faced with this kind of commitment, lots of students might decide, well, I just can't go to college because I simply can't afford it. And so that means that thousands, if not millions, of potential college students might just opt out of the college education that they need to move ahead in a 21st century economy just because they can't afford it. And you could argue that that is an assault on our core values. So, all of these would involve arguments of qualitative significance, answers to the so what question that backs up the quantitative significance of the facts and figures behind student loan debt. So once we've established the ill, the next thing that we need to do is to try to figure out what causes that problem. Brings us to the stock issue of blame. And there's two ways that you can go here. The first way is what's referred to as structural cause. One area of argument to determine the cause of the problem is to argue that the blame is the result of a defect that's an integral part of the nature of the current policy system. In other words, there are just structures and patterned behaviors and perhaps laws or regulations or other elements that are systemic problems requiring repair. Things that need to be fundamentally fixed that if they aren't fixed by a policy change, just aren't going to change by themselves. So when you think about the problem of student loan debt, there's a number of different things going on that you can imagine are problems of a structural system. First of all, the fact that college costs have been going up nationwide for years and going up in ways that are outstripping the rate of inflation. At the same time, we also have the need for an advanced degree beyond a high school diploma increasing significantly over the past few generations. At the same time, real family income has been going down over the past decade or so. So while costs are going up and folks feel that they need to go to college, at the same time, families don't have as much money as they used to have in order to pay for these degrees. And finally, to make matters worse, we have a student loan industry that in recent years has been identified as engaging in predatory practices. In other words, having specific requirements on student loans that are particularly onerous for borrowers. You're going to have folks that need to take out college loans because it's the only way they could possibly pay for college. Loans are being offered at subprime rates that are going to be ultimately very difficult for students and their families to pay back after graduation. And so that means that students are going to be hit with massive interest levels in their debts after they graduate, and the levels of student loan defaults are skyrocketing. So all of these constitute systemic problems in student loans and the costs of college that are causing the current crisis. Now, structural blame by itself may be enough, but it's also important to point out that, well, there's reasons why the system isn't fixing itself. That gets to the second area of blame. Attitudinal cause. Attitudinal cause refers to opposition by those in a position of power or influence. It could be opposition within the governmental body that would be responsible for such a public policy. It might be opposition to significant special interests, be they business or political organizations. It could be opposition based on public opinion or a variety of different constituencies. The key here is that attitudinal cause, rather than being part of a structural system, arises from people's beliefs and values. So you can think about the relationship between structural and attitudinal cause this way. Structural causes have to do with problems in the system. Attitudinal causes are things that people believe and value that prevent the system from being fixed. This is what we would call in combination an inherent problem. Unless we engage in some specific policy action to overcome these oppositions, nothing's going to get done. So, if we get back to our student loan crisis, we might point to attitudinal causes that are described in this editorial cartoon. A college loan? You came to the right place, sonny. And so this is a funny but really troubling way to point out some of the problems in attitudinal causation when we're thinking about our current student loan industry. The cartoon is suggesting that there is a really overly cozy relationship between Sallie Mae, the primary student loan provider subsidized by the federal government, the big bank interests that essentially make their money off of the Sallie Mae student loan program, and Uncle Sam representing the federal government, who's complicit in this relationship as well. So essentially, one might make an argument, not just based on a cartoon, of course, but in other forms of evidence, that there is a real incestuous relationship between the primary student loan organization, big banks, and the federal government that have a vested interest in keeping our system the way it is right now, without making fundamental changes to the structure that would potentially help vulnerable college students and their families. So let's review what we've taken care of in this first of a two-part series on policy case issue analysis. We've reviewed the definitions of prima facie case, policy claim, and stock issues. What's important to pull out from here is that there are 4 key stock issues that any advocate of policy change must meet in order to fulfill the burden of proof and overcome presumption. Those 4 stock issues are ill, blame, cure, and benefits versus costs. We talked in some detail about the argument strategies for the stock issues of ill and blame. So when we come back for part 2, we'll pick up where we left off. We'll focus on argument strategies for the stock issues of cure and benefits versus costs, and then we'll briefly examine the issues brief, a document that you'll prepare that will provide the results of your issue analysis on all 4 stock issues, both for policy advocates and defenders of the status quo. Until then, I'll see you next time.